Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum, and welcome to another edition of Debunked here on INX Prime. My name is Sulaimaan Ravat. With the Hujjaj having just returned from the Holy Lands, many would be visiting the Hujjaj, enjoying a sip of Zamzam water and some dates. Now, Hujjaj are limited to 5 liters of Zamzam water per person, right? So they don't have that much. Therefore, if you go and visit, you probably get a small cup like this, and you take a sip or two, make the dua. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam had said, Ma'u zamzamin lima shuriba lah. That whatever your intention, whatever your supplication at the time of drinking the Zamzam water, inshallah, Allah will fulfill that for you in some way or the other. Now, we know that Zamzam water has a very special place in the hearts of Muslims and believers. The well is sacred. Its origin is based on a miraculous incident. It's flowing from the heart of Makkah, from the precincts of the Kaaba. However, there's been discussion for quite some time now in the community about those who sell Zamzam water to us. This discussion kind of escalates in the lead up to Ramadan, where many people who want Zamzam water, especially for the Ramadan period to break their fast, go out and purchase, and then there are questions around the authenticity and whether it is proper Zamzam water or whether unscrupulous individuals are actually selling you water that's not Zamzam at all, or water that's perhaps Zamzam but then mixed with other water. Well, an investigation has been conducted to answer the question that in terms of what we're purchasing here locally, are we truly drinking Zamzam water from the blessed Zamzam well? Because those who sell it locally, it's not cheap. So joining us now on the line from Muslim Views, we have the CEO, Mahmood Sanglay. He's behind a groundbreaking report which was published in the Muslim Views and revealed shocking findings from laboratory tests about locally sourced or purchased Zamzam water. Mahmood, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the program.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Moulana, and jazakallah for the invitation.
Well, let me start by asking you that what prompted you and your team to do an investigation into whether the water that is being sold here in South Africa as Zamzam is actually Zamzam? Was there a particular incident or a trend?
Well, initially, this is about 2 years ago. I think a journalist's mind is an inquiring mind. So when I saw the Zamzam water in a retail store about 2 or 3 years ago, we actually wanted to ask the key questions, and that is this Zamzam water the way it is sold in South Africa? Is it compliant with South African labeling regulations? That is one question. But then another question emerged, are the contents of these bottles actually authentic? So that's how the inquiry originally started. We also then had a few questions from members of the community who were curious to know if the water can actually be claimed to be authentic if we don't really have anything that can verify it. And I think that prompted us to do a series of lab tests. And from my knowledge, outside of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, I don't think anyone has actually tested Zamzam water for its authenticity in terms of the supply chain and in terms of the availability of the water in bottles at the retail stores. So this is fairly pioneering work that was done over the last few months.
So how many samples did you provide to the lab, and what specifically were they checking for?
Okay, that's really an important question, Moulana. So what we did was we obtained what we call control samples. And control samples are samples that you test other samples against. So the control samples had to be authentic. They had to be sourced directly from the kingdom. They had to be obtained from pilgrims who actually went there, who either collected it from the port of exit, whether it's in Jeddah or in Medina, or they had to decant it themselves in the Haram, or had to be issued the water by the officials in the Haramain, whether it's in Makkah or Medina. So we obtained 5 of those samples. And those 5 samples were tested in the laboratory for 2 things. Number one, for consistency with each other. They had to be consistent with one and the other, all of them together. And then they had to be consistent with the results, the chemical results of what is known to be the results of the geological survey. So that survey then tests the result, tests the water in terms of its chemical composition, the presence of the key chemicals in milligrams per liter. So that test then gave us the actual results of all the 5 samples that we obtained. They proved to be consistent, which was a sense of confidence that we had in the control samples, because we could say with confidence that these are authentic Zamzam samples. So these 5 samples were then kept one side, and the others, which were basically the retail samples that we purchased from the various stores across the country, including Gauteng, KZN, and the Western Cape, and then they were tested against the control. And those tests then gave us the final results that we were confident to actually write the report.
So take us through the findings then. From the samples collected across the various provinces, how many turned out to be 100% definitive Zamzam water, and what did the lab results say in terms of the others?
Okay, so the 5 samples, like I said, were tested and they were consistent in terms of the chemical composition for chloride, sulfates, fluoride, calcium, magnesium, sodium, and potassium. Those are the key chemicals, what they call anions and cations that constitute the water. And the KZN and Gauteng results were very consistent with what the control samples had manifested. So we could say with confidence that the readings and the values we obtained from the KZN and the Gauteng samples were very, very close to that of the controls, which means we could confidently say they were from the same source and they were therefore authentic Zamzam. These results were actually shared with a number of experts, hydrologists, geohydrologists, or hydrogeologists, and other lab specialists who also examined the results. They looked at them very closely and they gave us their official reports, and they came to the same conclusion. However, when it came to the Western Cape samples, a different picture emerged. There we found some very significant deviations from the profile of the chemicals in the controls. And that indicated that the Western Cape samples across the board were also consistent, but consistent in their deviation from the controls, which means that we could conclusively say they are not from the same source and therefore they are not authentic Zamzam. That essentially is our key finding. The other key finding was maybe not as significant or as important, but that all the labeling of all the Zamzam samples, including that from Saudi, are non-compliant with South African regulations. So although we have a standard in South Africa as far as labeling is concerned, when these Zamzam bottles are imported, they are not checked for compliance by the retailers or by the importers. But I think the health authorities and the border management agency might have something else to say about that, and that is still under investigation. But our key finding is that there's been a deviation, a significant deviation in the consistency of the Western Cape samples from that of the controls, and therefore they could not be regarded as authentic.
I'll come back now to the deviation, right, and the nature of it. I'm just interested in this aspect of the labeling. What are the South African regulations, and where are these labels falling short, including the ones coming from Saudi?
Yes, so there's we have an act, the Foodstuffs Disinfectants Act, etc., that actually covers a range of different foodstuffs, including bottled water. And there's a regulation called Regulation 718 of 2006 on the labeling of bottled water. And that regulation specifies 5 rules that the bottlers of drinking water needs to comply with. The one is the naming of the product, the environmental source, it's the description of the product, the physical address of the source, the method of sanitization, and the chemical composition. All of this information must appear on the bottle. And I must say, Moulana, throughout 3 out of the 5 rules were not observed by the various bottlers. So example, typically the physical address of the source, the method of sanitization, and the chemical composition were typically absent from all the samples that we tested.
So coming back to the deviations, right? Those samples that prove not to be authentic, were they 100% fake, or was it Zamzam water was being mixed with other water?
So that determination has not been made, whether it's diluted or whether it is completely from a different source. That requires another series of tests to make that determination. But what has been determined is it is not from the same source. So what we can say with confidence, this is not genuine Zamzam. So in order to come to the conclusion uh, regarding the question that Maulana is asking, it requires what we call the isotope test results, which we have done, but we haven't relied on those results yet because further negotiations with the laboratory, with the lab needs to be undertaken. So we didn't rely on those tests yet. But what an isotope test does, an isotope test actually creates what we call a fingerprint of the origin, a geological fingerprint of the origin of a source of water. So if one has the chemical composition of Zamzam water from its authentic source at the well, which is a few meters away from the Kaaba in Makkah, that water has what we call an isotope fingerprint. And once the water is tested for its geological origin, if you get the isotope results, then that fingerprint or those results, what we call the values that are obtained from the isotope test, the analysis, are then tested against those of other sources of water. And then when one can then geologically say that the origin of this sample is exactly the same as the origin of that sample. So we can presume at this stage that the KZN and Gauteng samples, they show a isotope fingerprint that is identical to the ones in Makkah, the ones of the control samples. But the results also indicate that the fingerprint of the Western Cape samples is significantly different from that of the controls. So you get the same conclusion, but obtained through a completely different kind of scientific test.
These tests, is it a costly exercise? Is there anything else that was discovered? I mean, we know as Muslims and we believe in the miraculous powers of Zamzam water. The scientists involved in the test, did they observe anything that amazed them in terms of those samples that were authentic or the control samples?
Well, they weren't given that brief. What they did find, though, because I think when it comes to all kinds of water that is tested, is there are certain limits that needs to be observed when it comes to drinking water and its health properties. So the scientists that we did consult, some of them were Egyptian scientists who have written academic articles on Zamzam water. That link is actually on in our article on online. And that academic paper, which they have published, indicates the health benefits and health properties of authentic Zamzam. So that is there. And the other specialists and scientists that we've consulted, they weren't given the brief to give us feedback on the health benefits and properties of the Zamzam that was tested in the lab. That wasn't part of the focus of the article. But what's really interesting is that we actually looked at a few of the chemicals that Zamzam actually contains. And one of them is potassium. And potassium, Maulana, occurs in the Zamzam at levels between 30 to 35 milligrams per liter, which is a very good value for health purposes. The World Health Organization stipulates that a maximum limit for potassium is 50 milligrams per liter, which means it shouldn't exceed that. Or if it does reach 50, it can actually be hazardous to your health when consumed in more than just moderate quantities. So that is a limit. What we found there, though, when we tested the when you tested the sample of the Western Cape, and we talk about 9 samples from 9 different retail stores. We're not mentioning the names of the retail stores because they're not implicated in this at all. It is more the distributor, the supplier. That distributor had supplied all the 9 retail outlets. Rather, it's 9 samples from about 5 retail outlets, sorry. It's 9 samples from 5 retail outlets, some of them larger samples in, let's say, 1 liter bottles and some in 300 ml bottles and so forth. So these 9 samples all indicated a reading of 2 and less. In other words, 2 milligrams per liter of potassium in each of these samples. So they were fairly consistent in terms of the actual values, but they also indicated that they have a far lower reading of potassium compared to authentic Zamzam, which means that the health benefit of authentic Zamzam showing between 30 to 35 milliliters per milligrams per liter is significantly different from the Zamzam that is found in the Western Cape. However, and this is another interesting part of the story, is that the distributor provided us with his own lab results of the test that he had done on his Zamzam in a lab in Cape Town. And we actually look at that report and we contacted the lab because we found something quite curious, in fact, something quite alarming in that report. And that report had stated that the contents of potassium in the samples that they tested of the distributor's own laboratory, from his own samples of his own store, had showed a reading of 120 milligrams per liter. Now, remember, I said earlier that the World Health Organization places a limit of 50 milligrams per liter in terms of what is safely consumable by human beings. And when a reading shows 120 milliliter, it's actually hazardous to your health. And that was the finding made by a lab that tested the distributor's water in a completely different laboratory. So we we have some serious questions regarding the kind of samples in the water that the distributor actually claims he is selling. And I think that requires further investigation as well.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question about whether the water that was tested and turned out to be not authentic was just that, not authentic, or was it actually hazardous? And I think you've answered that. So what was the distributor's explanation then in terms of your findings?
Well, yeah, we did put that question to him, and he can't explain the discrepancy. But remember, what I'm saying is that the water that he tested in his laboratory showed those readings. The water that means his water that we obtained from all his retail buyers, from all the retail stores that he supplies, that reading actually showed less than 2 milligrams per liter, which isn't hazardous at all, but which is much less than the authentic Zamzam that one finds in the kingdom. So it's 2 different labs with 2 different results, extremely different results, and both of which indicate that it is not authentic Zamzam, whereas the authentic Zamzam has a reading of 30 to 35 milliliters, milligrams per liter.
Beyond the potassium aspect, right? Did the distributor have any explanation in terms of where he was sourcing his Zamzam from and why he felt that it was authentic? Did you get a sense that perhaps the deception is not at local level, but maybe from the side of whomever they are purchasing it from on beyond our borders or in the kingdom? Did any of that come to the fore in the investigation?
Well, yes and no, Moulana, and I want to be clear and careful about this because I wouldn't use words like deception because that indicates intent to deceive. I wouldn't want to say there was intent to deceive. I would say that at this stage it is very, very unclear as to what the intention was and what he knows and didn't know at the time. But the claims that he made are the ones that we tested, and we found some of those claims not to be true. There were a number of other claims that he made as well, which I think can be followed up, some of which may be very plausible, and some of which may still need to be verified. One of them that needs to be verified, for example, and which actually might even be plausible, is that we need to look at the question of the supply chain. And the supply chain basically is that we have something quite unique when it comes to Zamzam, and there is only one place on the planet Earth where Zamzam flows from. And that is part of our history, it's part of the Islamic tradition. Maulana's quoted a very important hadith in this respect. And I think when it comes to the Muslim narrative on what is tradition and what is important as part of our heritage, Zamzam actually ranks very, very high in that respect. So the supply chain is an important question for us because Zamzam is very unique when it comes to a source of water, unlike any other source of water on the whole planet. So the chain of custody, the supply chain is an important inquiry. And coming back to your question, Mona, about what the distributor had claimed, one of the claims that he is making is that he is sourcing Zamzam from a different supplier than most people are getting it in the kingdom. Now, that requires some unpacking because there are two important facts that I think we need to bear in mind. Zamzam water is reticulated from the well, and this happened a few decades ago when the Saudi kingdom produced a system whereby Zamzam can be transported from the well to a plant about 5 kilometers from Makkah, in a plant in Kudai, which is outside of Makkah. It is the King Abdullah plant where the water is sanitized, it is stored, and it is bottled and distributed. So those processes happen outside of the haram itself. And then it is obviously brought back in bottles and given to pilgrims. Some of it is consumed after it comes back from the Kudai plant. It's consumed inside of the haram, where those receptacles are placed in the haram on the mataf, and pilgrims then decant it and drink it there in Makkah and in Medina as well, because there are tankers that take the water both to the haram in Makkah and to the haram in Medina. So that water, that authentic Zamzam, is consumed on site. The Zamzam that is bottled is also bottled in Kudai, and that is then transported to the various distribution points where pilgrims obtain them. They either buy them or they are given it at the various ports of exit, and then they bring it home. Now, that whole process is well known. What our distributor is claiming is that he sources his Zamzam from a completely different plant. Now that needs a verification. What sounds bizarre and maybe untrue may quite be plausible. Why? Because Zamzam, authentic Zamzam, is actually abundantly available outside of the kingdom. There are 5 liter samples that we have tested that have proven to be authentic. Some of them come from Gauteng and KZN, but some of them are also available overseas in various other countries. The question then arises, and this is a second important fact that I need to mention here, is that the export of Zamzam from the kingdom is actually illegal. There's a law, it's called the water law in Saudi, that stipulates that Zamzam water exports are not permitted. So if that is the case, the question then arises, how come so much of Zamzam is available so abundantly outside of the kingdom? And I think that question still needs further investigation. And it also speaks to the claims that the distributor is making when it comes to the water that he obtains from his supplier, and that all other distributors in South Africa and elsewhere in the world also obtain. Where do they get their supply from if the water export from the kingdom is not permitted, if it's illegal? So that's a completely different investigative question, which we hope to inquire and hope to follow through, inshallah, in future.
Just for clarity, so the samples you tested and the ones that turned out not to be authentic, not to be Zamzam water, was it all linked to one distributor in the Western Cape, or were there other distributors as well?
The answer is yes, Maulana, only one distributor. I have found no other importer or distributor in the Western Cape that supplies the retail stores that we have obtained our samples from.
So, in conclusion then, Mahmood, going forward, what needs to happen now? Because people want reassurance. People know that they pay a hefty amount to purchase Zamzam water here locally. They do it willingly because of their belief and because of the value that they attach to Zamzam water. But you don't want to pay and consume and afterwards find out that not only is it not Zamzam water, but it could also be hazardous to your health. So what needs to happen going forward? What advice can you share with consumers?
Well, the Gauteng and KZN consumers can be reasonably assured that their distributors are obtaining their Zamzam from whoever their supplier is, whether it is ethical or unethical, legal or illegally exported from the kingdom, that's a different question. But when it comes to the actual the lab tests, it proves to be authentic. So that is an assurance that maybe can be given to the consumers in Gauteng and KZN. Western Cape, it's more difficult. I think the consumer here in our province is clearly disadvantaged. We don't know what we are buying when we go to the various retail stores because the tests that we have done indicates that it is not authentic. However, if it's possible to obtain a 5 liter and bring it from Gauteng or KZN, then you are more likely to be consuming authentic Zamzam. Um, Alternatively, the people who come from Hajj and who come from Umrah, they are they have the 5 liters with them, and if that is shared among the family and close relatives, then I think they can be assured they are consuming Zamzam. But outside of that, it is very hard to say that if you buy Zamzam at a local retail store in the Western Cape, that what you're consuming is authentic.
Mahmoud, shukran so much for your time and for chatting to us. We really appreciate it.
Jazakallah Maulana and shukran for your time.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
That's CEO of Muslim Views, Mahmood Sanglay. He was talking to us about an article that he penned about different samples of Zamzam water available here in South Africa that were tested in a lab and went through a process, and the ones that proved to be authentic from those that didn't prove to be authentic, and why the problem seems to be more acute in the Western Cape, and the different discussions around the issues associated with that. Like I said in my introduction, and I conclude on that, Zamzam water has value in all our eyes. And we'd all like to have Zamzam water stocked at home for various reasons, and especially coming up to periods like Ramadan, etc., you want a greater supply, but you want to have a reasonable assurance that what you're buying and what you're paying for is actually Zamzam water. And I think we've got to compliment Muslim Views and the team, therefore, undertaking this investigation. Until next time, inshallah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.